After years of war, 1945 was supposed to be the dawn of a new promise for the Black Country. It was a promise of secure work, tight-knit communities, and a future built on the same industrial might that had just powered a nation to victory. A collective sigh of relief swept the region as its formidable factories switched from making the tools of war back to the rhythms of peace. Workers streamed back into the foundries and glassworks, ready to forge a new world. But in the space of a single lifetime, that promise would be broken piece by piece. The roar of the foundries would fall silent, leaving a question on the lips of those who had built it all. A landscape once defined by the glow of furnaces and the silhouettes of headstocks would be changed forever. What on earth happened? To really get what was lost, we have to remember how it all began. The Black Country came out of World War II, scarred but proud, its reputation as Britain's industrial heartland stronger than ever. The forges and factories of Dudley, Sandwell, Walsall and Wolverhampton had been the engine of the war effort. And now they were the engine of recovery. Men and women, demobilized from the army, came home to the familiar shifts and the unique camaraderie of the workshop floor. But this wasn't some overnight success story. The late 1940s were still grey. Rationing, a grim wartime necessity, stuck around as a constant reminder of the nation's empty pockets. Families had to get creative, making do with what they had. Meat was a luxury, and the ration book wasn't fully abolished until 1954, a full 9 years after the war ended. For a whole generation of kids, life without a ration book was completely unknown. And yet, under all that austerity, hope was quietly building. There was a tremendous sense of pride. The region was a giant workshop, famous for making just about everything. It wasn't just the heavy grunt work of iron and steel. The Black Country produced it all. From the intricate chains of Cradley Heath to the world's finest glass. From pots and pans to the parts that drove the nation's car industry. It was home to beloved brands like Marsh and Baxter, whose Brierley Hill factory was famous across the Midlands for its pork pies and sausages, a huge employer whose products were a household name even during rationing. This incredible range of goods was the key to Britain's economic comeback, and the people of the Black Country knew it. There was a job for anyone who wanted one. Full employment wasn't a political promise, it was just a fact of life. The smoke that filled the air, what one writer famously called black by day and red by night, wasn't seen as pollution. It was the smell of prosperity, the proof that the region was hard at work. As Britain finally threw off the last chains of post-war austerity, a new energy swept in, and it came with a soundtrack. Rock and roll, blasting out of America, found a ready audience in the Black Country. For teenagers who'd grown up with rationing and making do, this music was like a lightning bolt. Artists like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Bill Haley delivered a sound that was loud, rebellious, and all theirs. This was more than just music. It was the start of a real youth culture. For the first time, young people had their own money from jobs in the booming factories. They spent it on transistor radios, records, and clothes that made their parents shake their heads. Local dance halls and cafes pulsed with a beat that was a universe away from the big bands their parents listened to. It created a generation gap, a cultural split in working-class families that, until then, had mostly shared the same world. Many parents saw the music as a bad influence, its rhythm and blues roots stirring up old fears of delinquency. But for the kids, it was the sound of freedom, an escape from the factory routine that had defined their parents' lives. While the teenagers danced, the ground beneath their feet was starting to shift, unnoticed. The 1960s were the absolute peak. The industrial machine was firing on all cylinders. New housing estates were replacing old terraces, tower blocks were reaching for the sky, and the wages were good. But look closer, and you could see the warning signs. A serious labor shortage, especially for the tough, hot jobs in the foundries, meant that some positions were getting harder to fill. To keep the engine running, Britain looked to the Commonwealth, and workers from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent arrived, drawn by the promise of good pay and steady work. Then came a tremor, the closure of Baggeridge Colliery in 1968. This was the end of deep coal mining in the Black Country, an industry that had literally fueled its rise for centuries. At the time, it might have seemed like a one-off, just a single casualty of progress. But looking back, it was the first major crack in the mighty wall of black country industry. The golden era, with its full employment and teenage rebellion, was living on borrowed time. The 1970s started with an unsettling murmur that would soon become a roar. The certainties of the post-war world started to feel shaky. All that optimism of the 50s and 60s felt like a distant memory, replaced by a creeping anxiety. The idea of a job for life, of following your dad into the steelworks, suddenly seemed less like a guarantee and more like a gamble. The world was changing fast. The oil shocks of the 70s made energy prices skyrocket, hitting power-hungry industries hard. At the same time, global competition was heating up. Countries like Germany and Japan were making steel and other goods cheaper and more efficiently. The very products that had made the black country's name were now being undercut by imports. Even a huge investment in modern electric furnaces at Round Oak in the early 70s couldn't stop the tide. For the first time in a generation, people started hearing those dreaded words, cutbacks and redundancies. The job cuts began at major plants like Round Oak Steelworks. The workforce, which had peaked at around 3,000 people, was slowly being chipped away. Then came the big blows. The closure of the massive Marsh and Baxter pork products factory in Brierley Hill in 1978 was a huge shock, followed by the Bilston Steelworks in 1979 and the Patent Shaft Steelworks in Wednesbury in 1980. Each closure sent shockwaves through the community, a ripple effect of lost wages, cancelled orders for smaller suppliers, and a growing dread of what was next. You could feel the change. It wasn't just about money, it was a full-blown identity crisis. For more than 100 years, the black country was its industry. Generations of families had worked side by side in the same factories. These weren't just workplaces, they were communities where people said working there felt like being part of a huge extended family. Now, that family was being torn apart. The decade ended, not with a bang, but with a deep, profound sense of unease. The murmur of decline had become a reality you couldn't ignore. If the 70s were a tremor, the 80s were the earthquake. This was the decade of the Great Decline, the period that truly ended the era of heavy industry in the black country. The closures came thick and fast, a relentless dismantling of a way of life that had stood for 150 years. The final day for Round Oak Steelworks in Brierley Hill came just before Christmas, on December 23, 1982. After 125 years, the furnaces went cold for the last time, and more than 1,500 people lost their jobs in a single day. Crane operator Michael Lyon remembers being on a tea break with his mates when the news came over the radio, a complete shock. For Brierley Hill, the closure was devastating. Unemployment shot up to around 25%, one of the highest rates in the country. This wasn't just a factory closing, it felt like the heart of the town was being ripped out, and it was the same story all across the region. Rubery Owen, Pyramid Industries, and countless other foundries and factories shut their gates for good. The iconic glass quarter, which had made world-famous crystal, faded. The landscape itself started to change. Blast furnaces that had lit up the night sky were brought down in controlled explosions. The huge chimney stack at Round Oak had already been demolished in 1978, a sign of what was to come, and by 1984, the entire plant was gone. The human cost was immense. A generation of highly skilled men suddenly found their trades were obsolete. Well-paid industrial jobs were replaced with low-wage, insecure work in the service sector, if they were replaced at all. It wasn't just unemployment. It was the rise of economic inactivity. As thousands were moved onto incapacity benefits, a hidden scar of job loss that would affect the region for decades. By the 1990s, the transformation was nearly complete. Heavy industry was, for the most part, gone. In Brierley Hill, something new began to rise from the ashes of the steelworks. An enterprise zone was created, and developers Don and Roy Richardson started building the Merry Hill Shopping Centre on the old site. A place of fire and iron was becoming a place of retail and commerce. The first offices on the new waterfront development, built on the exact footprint of the old works, opened in 1990. As the millennium drew to a close in 1999, the Black Country was a profoundly different place. The air was cleaner, a direct result of Clean Air Acts and, frankly, the absence of heavy industry. Old industrial sites were now quiet, either reclaimed by nature or reborn as retail parks and housing estates. The demolition of 2 of the Eve Hill tower blocks in Dudley that year felt symbolic, another piece of the post-war dream disappearing from the skyline. The end of this era wasn't the end of the Black Country itself. It was a brutal, painful transition that left deep, lasting scars. But this story isn't just about loss. It's also about the incredible resilience and the mighty spirit of a people who watched their entire world collapse and still found a way to carry on. The character and ingenuity that were forged in the heat of the foundries didn't just vanish when the fires went out. This is such a huge, emotional story, and we've only scratched the surface. For so many of you watching, this isn't just history. It's your life. It's the story of your parents, your grandparents, your street, and your town. Do you remember the sky glowing orange from the furnaces? Do you remember the sound of the factory whistle? What was it like for you? Please, share your memories in the comments below. By sharing these stories, we keep the memory of that era and the people who built it alive for a new generation. Thanks for watching.